fill us in on World War I and some of World War II. So we'll just kind of keep it going here. I think if you have questions, raise your hand, or do you want them to wait till the end? Whatever. So I guess I'll leave that up to whoever's speaking if they want to entertain questions as they're going or whatever. So we're glad you all came. We have had this Historical Foundation since 1993, and Thelma, who is going to speak, was one of the founders of that. So we're glad she was able to come today. And we have several other members here of the foundation. So anyway, hope you enjoy the program. So go ahead, Burdette. We would like to hear the Gettysburg Address.
The Battle of Gettysburg was fought during the first 3 days of July 1863 and was the decisive struggle of the great Civil War. The Union Army under General Meade numbered 100,000, and he estimated that of General Lee at 80,000 men. The world's history contains no story of more exalted heroism than that which marked the grapple of those mighty hosts, when the ground shook under the thunder of 225 cannon, and thousands gave up their lives for the cause which they believed to be just. On November 19, 1863, some 4 months after the battle, the Gettysburg National Cemetery was dedicated. The address of Edward Everett occupied an hour and was delivered with the skill and polish which stamped him as the greatest of then living American orators. At its close, when the applause had subsided, the tall, gaunt form of President Lincoln rose and came slowly forward. He held in his hands 1 or 2 loose sheets of paper, upon which he had penciled a few thoughts while on the train coming from Washington. Amid the hush of the large assemblage, without displaying any of the graces of the finished orator, and in the space of barely 5 minutes, he summed up with masterly eloquence the true philosophy of the stupendous struggle. What he said will remain a classic through the coming ages. Listen to his immortal words. 87 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of it as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives, that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, no longer remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they here gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall
Thelma, come on up and.
Hello there, everybody. And my just my ancestor, Cornelius Okones, way back in the 1860s, early 1860s. I think he and his wife were married in 1861. Anyway, so he's the younger man, and he decided it was time to pull up stakes and come to America. And he pulled up a lot of stakes. He brought his parents, a sister, a brother, his own wife, and 2 little ones on the ship, and they sailed for the United States. And arrived here, I think, in 1863. They had, as any of you that ever read about these things, it was a very rough voyage, and to the point that they lost one of their children, a little boy, died aboard ship, and he was buried at sea then. And the family story goes that all that they found was a sock on the deck. You know, it's so sad, isn't it? We just don't understand all the trials and hardships that all our people went through. Well, anyway, I don't have very much about them arriving in the United States, except they landed right away in Freeport, Illinois. I don't think there was a plane for them or anything, but that's all the information I have anyway. Freeport, Illinois, and they needed a means of support. Guess what? They didn't have money to support themselves. So Cornelius and his brother, Peter, enlisted in the Illinois regiment that was fighting for the freedom of all the people. And then it was, since, I don't think I made this very clear before though, this Cornelius' parents were with him, and of course they were in their late 50s, early 60s age group. So they would get the payment, the monthly payments or whatever, however often they were paid for the soldiers from the one boy, Peter, and Cornelius's wife and surviving child would get another payment for his service in the Civil War. So they had that means of income, you know, in Illinois. And Freeport, Illinois, was a hotbed of those region people, folks. If you ever go to a cemetery in that area or something, you'll see all kinds of names that are right off of our cemeteries here, you know. It's the same families. So that's where they were for over a year. And when war was settled, then it was time to be sent back to Freeport, and Peter was sick. He was a single man, and was not able to write his name. The papers that we have, he signed with an X, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. And anyway, he died of that, what we today would call the flu, intermittent fever or something like that, and is buried then in I think it's Louisiana. And so Cornelius came back to Freeport, and after they had everything settled, brought all that family to Iowa. His parents, a sister, and his own children. They all came to Iowa, to good old Grundy County. And you know, I think it's 1865, wasn't it? That when Iowa became a state, I think.
46.
Anyway, it was right in that little branch of years there. So they settled in, it would be just south, about a mile from, maybe a couple of miles from this road that goes east-west through town, west 3rd and 4th Street. But anyway, they lived there for some time, and didn't like it. They didn't like that life. Something didn't settle with them. So they left they had 2 sons that were able to maintain the ownership of the tract of land. And the older people, Cornelius and his wife, and they took his parents, went on to Nebraska because that was the thing that was going on right then. Nebraska was really advertising for settlers. And so they settled in the southern part of Nebraska, and Cornelius then was a very strong supporter of organizing the Christian Reformed Church and the Reformed Church here in town. And so he was what I would call a circuit rider, and he rode from home to home, and they would have their church services in the home. This is all in Nebraska. And he and his wife and 3 more children were living in a sod house. And finally, the 2 sons that were left here in Wellsburg area, they got word of their plight because they were almost starving to death, and went down, got them, brought them back home. And they never left Wellsburg after that. But by then, Cornelius became he worked for the county as an assessor, and he had his own shop. And I believe Tammy has pictures of these things. But he had a leather shop where he did harnesses and shoes and anything of that nature, And ran his business. It was he and his wife lived in Wellsburg, just a little bit north of Main Street, and passed away in 1914. And his wife passed away a year before that. It didn't quite make 80 years old, I think. But anyway, they have an interesting history. And let me see what I probably left out a few things here. But Cornelius is buried in our Wellsburg Reformed Church Cemetery. But he was also a part of the organization of the Christian Reform in East, that's west, right? West of us here. So they got their name on a lot of different things. Let me see, I'm checking to see if I left something out here. But their action as a soldier, this was their means of income. And I think it was interesting that if any of the family wanted to know more about their life in Germany, they didn't get much of an answer. And the reason very few of Ostfriesian people would talk about their life in Germany and East Frisian country, because they said, we came to America, we are Americans, period. So we have very little history to tell about the people, in most cases. But they had a good life here and never regretted moving to Iowa. Any questions? Tell me something that I may have left out that you would.
I got a question. Who are you talking? Who was his last name? I couldn't hear it for
Okones. Now, my dad's, that would be my great-grandfather, Cornelius Okones.
I couldn't hear it because the air conditioner was on.
But I found out just within the last couple of years that this other name that was all on the lists of the borders on ships and so on, it was Okones also. But that was a whole nother generation back.
That was your great-grandfather.
Yeah, 2 greats.
Wow, they're old.
I have a question. You said they didn't want to talk about Germany, but did they talk German or English?
Oh, very much German. Because
Yes, they talk German.
English was the newer language, and it took a while for them to adapt that. And I imagine the German pronunciation or phrases, you know how
Yeah.
we like to use some of them, they probably use them all the time. And in my growing up years, we often would have company visiting my parents. Both sides would speak German, and we could listen all we wanted to and not hear anything because it was all German. We never got any secrets that way. But that's an interesting point, though. We have a lady that will talk to, like, Vi Adams, and she's talked to me too already. They're trying to find out more about the Ostfriesian dialect and the German talking of those years when they came here, because they feel that here it's in its original form, you know, the way they brought it here. We didn't embellish it any. But in Germany, they would change with progress, you know, and so some of the words were forgotten. But it's really almost a dead-end street. It's awfully hard to do. And to talk to me about the German, I don't remember. I talked German before I went to school, though, before I started first grade.
Yeah.
But I was speaking English by the time I went into class. But if you wanted to talk to your grandparents or something like that, you had to be able to speak the language and understand what they said. Of course, it wouldn't be very deep for a child, small child, but still, that's what it was. Any other questions?
Cornelius Okones, he was in Company C of the 46th Illinois,
Uh-huh.
same as mine.
Yeah. And I think that Tammy has a picture of it. I have one too, but you know how that is when you have a lot of pictures. It's hiding right now. But on one trip that Jean and I took to see our son in Illinois, we came home to Freeport, and the main highway takes you right past this big monument for the Civil War veterans. And of course, we had to see if our censor's name was on there, and it is. It's halfway down one of the columns. It's an interesting monument. Yeah. And I realized in studying all these things that, you know, I mentioned that when they got on board ship, they had 2 children and lost one of the boys. And I think the oldest one, that was a girl, and she survived. But anyway, when they got to America, you know, then they had 3 or 4 more children. Well, I thought, my goodness, then my grandpa was a native-born American, wasn't he? Never thought about it like that before. So there's always interesting things that you find out about your family when you study it. But I imagine as a soldier, both of those men had quite a life. It was very primitive, and if you've read any of the war stories about, you know, the groups of people that would be fighting here and there, it was not a pretty scene at all. Many untrained people. Their firearms had to be very primitive. It's hard to us to picture how hard a life those people had, and yet they stood up for their rights, didn't they? So, is it time to move on to the next step? First, Tammy.
Tammy's
She's
up.
behind you.
Thank you.
Are you ready?
Nancy, can you shut the kitchen light off, please?
She's sweating back there.
Thank you. Very nice, Thelma, thank you.
So for World War I, we'll move into, I'll read In Flanders Fields that was written by Canadian Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae. In Flanders Fields the poppies blow, between the crosses row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky, the larks still bravely singing, fly scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead, short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Fields. Take up your quarrel with the foe, to you from failing hands we throw. The torch be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders Fields. And we want to remember those that paid the ultimate sacrifice for our freedom today. From World War I, we have our died in service is Henry H. Ashing, son of Sander and Kate Voss Ashing, husband of Jenny Wiltz, died 5 October 1918 of sickness in France. His remains were buried in the Wellsburg Reformed Church Cemetery 14 June 1920, nearly 2 years later. Daniel O. Niederhoff, son of Olio and Greicha Meester Niederhoff, died of sickness 24 May 1918 in Camp Dodge, Des Moines, Iowa. He is buried in the First Christian Reformed Church Cemetery. Court L. Bunger, son of Lambert C. and Greicha Ruter Bunger, died of sickness 9 October 1918 in Camp Pike, Arkansas, buried in the First Christian Reformed Church Cemetery. And Minnow Wiltz, son of Otto J. and Feincha Harms Wiltz, died of sickness 24 May 1918 in France. His remains were buried in Wellsburg Reformed Church Cemetery 8 June 1920, 2 years later. And our killed in action soldiers. Helmut Aukes, son of D.E. and Marion Sins Aukes, was killed on a battlefield in France on 23 October 1918. His remains were buried in Pleasant Valley Evangelical Church Cemetery on 15 April 1921, over a year later. John Loaf, son of Henry and Kia Rindles Loaf, was killed 10 November 1918, the night before Armistice Day, on a battlefield in France. His remains were buried in Wellsburg Reformed Church Cemetery on 4 September 1921, nearly 2 years later. John H. Loaf kept a diary when he was in the service, and it was reprinted in the Wellsburg newspaper in 1920. So I'm going to read the entries that he had. The last news of John Loaf, August 5th, 1918, Camp Pike. All packed up and ready to leave. We are in quarantine. Where do we go? We drilled all day, spent the evening around the barracks. August 17th, went out to the rifle range and shot 120 rounds by noon. August 18th, were issued our overseas equipment and rifles, cleaned all the grease off our rifles in the evening, went to Belmont. August 19th, went to rifle range to set targets for another company. August 20 to 21, getting packs ready to leave Camp Pike. August 22, entrained at 11 a.m., dinner on train, detrained for hike at Poplar Bluffs, Missouri after supper, went to bed on train. August 23rd, got up at East St. Louis, Illinois, went through southern Illinois on Big 4 Road, detrained near Terre Haute, Indiana to battle in a small lake, went to sleep at Springfield, Ohio. August 24, got up at Cleveland, followed along lake on New York Central through Buffalo, New York, detrained at Rochester for a hike and shower bath at a Red Cross bathroom. At Syracuse, we had supper, served by the Red Cross. August 25, got up on west bank of the Hudson, came through my first tunnel at Beaumont near Camp Merritt at 8 a.m., walked to camp, and we were quarantined in our barracks. Busy the next 5 days getting our OD clothes and packing up for overseas. August 31st, left Camp Merritt at 1 a.m. with packs and rifles. 5-mile hike and landed on board a ferry for New York. Disembarked from ferry and were served coffee and buns by the Red Cross. Embarked on the English steamship Donegal Castle at 9 a.m. Left dock at 5 p.m. Anchored at mouth of harbor. Slept in hammock till next afternoon at 3 o'clock. Out of sight of land at dark. September 2nd, a few getting seasick. Nice weather. September 3, more sick. Still nice weather. September 4, nearly everybody is sick. Sea beginning to roll a little. Am appointed KP at our mess, feeling just a little sick. September 5, got up from my hammock feeling fine and felt fit all the way over. Was stormy and rough for 4 days. September 13, saw the first of the Irish shore. Followed the rocky coast till afternoon when we entered the Clyde in Scotland. September 15, entrained in the morning at Glasgow for Camp Stanton, an American camp in England. Arrived at Winchester at 3 a.m. September 16, marched 5 miles on road to camp. Arrived there at 5 a.m. in the dark, quarantined in tents. Tent mates J.L. Lockheed and E. Luck. September 20th, was on guard all night and up until noon. September 27, got up at 4:30, packed up, left Camp Stanton at 8:15 for Southampton, 9 miles. Stopped for dinner, which we carried with us at an American camp near Southampton. rested till 3:30, and marched through Southampton to a boat landing. Took boat at 6 p.m. Was seasick at 12 o'clock for the first time since I left New York. September 28. Landed in France at 7 a.m. and marched 5 miles to an American camp in rain and mud and water. Stayed 2 days and nights in tents, cold as blazes. September 30. Left camp at 5 o'clock in the afternoon after supper and marched back to Charborough. Landed in boxcars, 36 men in a car, and arrived at Le Mans next day at 11 a.m. Marched out to an American camp. Were given some new equipment. Stayed overnight. October 2nd. Hiked over the town in the morning. After dinner, marched to train station and boarded cars. Rode about 3 hours, unloaded, and marched about 8 miles to camp. Were billeted in barns. Next day, we cleaned up all the stuff and filled our bed sacks. October 4th. Started drilling for about 2 weeks, and we started for the rifle range, at which we stayed 4 days. Started back to our billets, which were about 5 miles from the rifle range, at a town they called Economy, about 15 miles from Le Mans. October 23rd, went to rifle range. October 26th, we left Economy for the front. October 28th, stopped at Boulogne and got a cup of hot coffee and built a fire to warm up. Stopped at La Tour, October 27, for some coffee and then went on again. Thus ends the simple diary. On the next page is inscribed in a different handwriting, in large letters, the single word, loaf. The boy's soldiering was ended, and he was at rest. Perhaps the last few words symbolizes the military career of the dead boy and epitomize his and many other young man's sacrifice. We went on. They did go on and on, giving their all that the world might save all, until success and victory crowned their efforts. And as we go on, let us mourn them, but more let us honor them, and finally, let us so act that we may crystallize and perpetuate the ideals for which they gave their lives. Quite a moving diary. So now in World War II, we have our killed in action soldiers. Lawrence Bokoff, son of John B. and Mary Vanderwerf Bokoff, died 25 December 1944. A ship where he was aboard was attacked and sunk by the enemy in the English Channel. His remains were not recovered, and he is buried at sea. Perry Clapsaddle, son of Leslie L. and Verna Tasso Clapsaddle, husband of Wilma Ross, was killed while entering Czechoslovakia with Patton's Third Army on 21 April 1945. He is buried in France. George E. Finger, son of Edward and Tilly Bowman Finger, was killed in action in New Guinea on 15 December 1942. He was buried 28 June 1948 at St. Peter's United Church of Christ Cemetery. Arnold H. Gelder, son of Dick Sr. and Marie Gray Gelder, died 22 July 1943 while fighting in North Africa during the invasion of Sicily. His remains were buried 15 August 1948 in the Wellsburg Reformed Church Cemetery. Franklin A. Jaspers, who was our first local boy that was killed, is the son of Harm and Kate Vanengay Jaspers. He died 26 November 1942 while fighting the Japanese in New Guinea. His remains were buried 13 July 1948 in the Wellsburg Reformed Church Cemetery. Darwin Cruz, son of A.T. and Kate Toomson Cruz, died 30 July 1945 on the sinking of the cruiser Indianapolis. His remains were not recovered, and he is buried at sea. Wallace C. Lindemann, son of Jake H. and Amelia Rixman Lindemann, died 16 April 1945 in the German theater of war. He is buried in the Netherlands.
I was wondering where I put this. Don't be frightened. It isn't that much. In fact, might not be anything. Here we go. So, war on the home front. I was asked to come up with some memories of those years. And so I am telling this, trying to tell this through the eyes of girl 10, 11, 12, going on 13 years. So I'm in 6th grade when the war is declared. And so how does it affect the kids? Not very much at first. We had small classes, you know, and we talked about it at home on the radios and so on, the news, newspapers. There was always war news. But I think, like many people, we didn't know how serious to take this. And yet our boys were being drafted. Some were being sent home again because they didn't quite qualify, you know, health-wise and so on. And it was very turmoil time when families were trying to keep their people at home, and yet we had to have people going in the service, and it was just a mystery, you know, how long this would last and all that kind of stuff. So that's my that was my 6th grade year, and we had, just to give you a picture of the classroom, we had 7th graders. I'm in the 7th grade now. All of a sudden I passed. So here we are, 8 7th graders. That's my class. I think 2 or 3 of us from town. The rest are all from the country. And we had in the same classroom 3 or 4 8th graders. That's how big our class was. And guess who our teacher was? You'll never guess. It was Sally Bush. Sally Bush Gooseman. So nice to have you here for that. But she was one of my favorite teachers, and that's not just because your daughter's here. But we got really close with her. She did so much with us kids, taught us so many things, but that's all beside the point right now. Some memories of school is on every Friday we would have a stamp day, and you'd bring if you wanted to buy some stamps. What were these stamps used for? We had a little book. If you buy one stamp, it's 10 cents, and you could put that stamp in that book. And when you'd get that book filled, you'd have $18.75 invested. I don't know where the 5 cents come from, but anyway, that would be in there. And then you could save many years, and then you could have $25 for, or gain interest. So that was the idea. That was all part of the war program, saving program for things. And then Sally had a boyfriend at that time. It wasn't Peggy's dad, but it was in the Air Force, and was a pilot. And I don't know what the occasion was, but he had routed his flight right through Wellsburg. I say through because it was almost through. And so, how many of you remember the old schoolhouse? There's a real tall building. Well, we're in the top story of those windows, and just so you get a picture of how this is going to happen and work. And so it was arranged that he would give us a fly through at a certain time on a school day. And Sally, of course, was all excited about that sort of thing. And here we are, kids are all like this, looking out these high windows, and here comes this huge airplane right over the slide and everything, boom. And we all waved at the pilot and this co-pilot. What an exciting time that was. That really brought us, all the more patriotic all the way. But, I'll never forget that. That was one of the most exciting things during those years for me. But in the beginning, when war was declared, a little back, I had learned to play an instrument in the 4th grade. We were tested for music ability and that kind of stuff. And so a number of us tried out, and I was playing a saxophone at that time. And if the minute you have an instrument and could play a little bit, you were in the marching band. Well, I'm trying to get my bearings here. At the end of this block over here, that's that street going north and south. That's where we practiced marching first. And Leona Curtis, the banker's daughter, who lived in that house where Marshall is, Marshall Beving. And Leona, the princess of the whole outfit, you know, she came in with a special pin on this one morning for marching band. And this was like Pearl Harbor had started in the December, you know, and so the next spring, here comes Leona with this pin on her dress. It's another thing, you know, a 10-year-old doesn't forget. And it had a pearl and Pearl Harbor. Remember Pearl Harbor. Always thought of that pin every time we talked about World War II. That's, you know, it was, we didn't think that anything different of Leona, but she sure did have a beautiful pin. And a lot of the music that we played and stuff and marched to was patriotic, and always had that in almost every event had something like that in the background. You know, we were all very patriotic. Now I'm going to digress just a little bit from this for some general things in our community too. I told you about the marching band, but in our community we had a lot of groups working. Auxiliary ladies, I especially remember Mrs. Snitcher, Emma Snitcher, and different ones like that. And every Friday they'd get their uniforms on and take a carload of the ladies to Des Moines and help, I don't know what they all did, fold bandages and all these things that the auxiliary did, you know. And in the meantime, they'd have their meetings right here in Wellsburg too and do all these things. So I remember that quite well. And I never forgot Emma Snitcher. She was a character that you wouldn't forget. We had collection drives. Now this was all the first period of years, like the first 5 years of the war, you know, from 41 to 46 or so. Collected old tires. There was a mountain of old tires on one corner where our post office is still new to me too. But on that corner, they would take all these old used tires, and all that rubber was then, I'm going to simplify it. I don't really understand this, but they called it vulcanized, heated up, and would be reshaped into newer tires. And because all those materials were so scarce, they had to reuse almost anything they could get their hands on. And so that was one collection. Then another while, they'd collect newspapers. Tons of newspaper would be turned in. Another thing that we collected was metal. A lot of groves were collecting old plows and old pieces of machinery, you know, maybe buckets that would leak or things of that kind. And all those things were collected and sent to who knows where, all recycled into new metal and new machines. And along those lines, this is much simpler, but in every household, have any of you heard about a string ball in any house? Did you ever have that in your house? We had a string ball in our house. Yeah. And store string, all packages then were tied with string, no Scotch tape, folks. It was all string. And so if you'd have a piece this long or a couple of yards long or maybe just itty bitty ones, you tie them together and roll it in a ball, and you just keep adding that. And sometimes it'll come up in some comic strip, or they would make fun of it, you know, that the ball of string is in the cupboard, you know. But you saved everything. Everything had another use. And if you stop and think about that, there were a lot of things we have today we never heard of before. And I remember so well when I was in college, well, even before we went, there were no nylon stockings. There were a few rayon ones, but even they got to be scarce. So most of the younger gals, the older ladies would just stay with their cotton hose in, but the younger gals were treated with leg makeup, just like pancake makeup for your face. And so you'd have that all rubbed on your legs, you know, look just like a hose. And some gals that were quite artistic could even draw a dark line up the back of a seam up the back of her leg. And I remember one hot summer day, we were singing for a funeral on the cemetery with teenagers. And it was so warm, and we began to perspire, and our hose got a lot of runs out of that. Well, that's a little on the offside for this serious talk, but still, that was part of the day. Let me see, do we miss? There were more drives, but I can't really name them all or even think of more right now. We saved everything I have down here, and that I've said that before. When I went to high school, I had two uncles in the service, Harvey and George Sietsema, and they had stayed with us quite a lot. We were in town. We were townies. They were country boys. And anyway, as happened to almost every serviceman, they all gained weight and grew up in the service. You know, if you went in at 18 and you come out at 23 or so, you're going to be a much more mature person. And so they wouldn't be using those suits and dress pants that they had worn. So my mom would take them apart, press them good. There was no permanent press in these clothes at that time anyway. And that's where my high school clothes came from. I'd have skirts and jackets and things of that kind from their suits. And that's me, but you know, everybody's doing those things. So it was just another way to reuse something. So on the home front, my dad, I don't know if he had a special child or not, but I was telling about these blackouts. He went out one night and to make sure that the town of Wellsburg was dark. I mean, we would have blackouts practicing in case there would be an invasion from a foreign country, that no light would be shown so they couldn't identify a community. So the light would have to come out above the water tower. Everybody had to have all the shades pulled, preferably without light in that room, you know. And my dad had part of town, the west end over here, that he would patrol. There weren't that many houses then in those years, but he'd walk up and down the streets and to make sure that everybody had every source of light covered up, so that the possibility of air traffic would not be able to pick out a cluster of people living here. So we felt very involved in this war effort. Every once in a while something would come up that way out of your normal living pattern. Let me see. So, how to communicate, the soldiers and sailors, or whatever branch of service they were in, would often make a telephone call to their parents, or whatever the occasion was. And so we didn't have cell phones or anything, of course. So you would put in a general call to Wellsburg and maybe my parents' phone number or something, whoever they wanted to talk to. And you would talk to, there was somebody before Carrie Bookoff, but I always think of Carrie Bookoff up there as the main telephone operator for that time anyway. And, well, you never knew if there was a phone call coming or not, so quite often nobody was at home. And Carrie would know our family so well that if we weren't home and someone called us, she'd start with the grandparents, and she'd call all those homes until she found that couple, and so they could talk to the telephone. Isn't that's sort of a touching story, isn't it? But and it could be any time of the day that she would do that. That was just. Sometimes it even got in the paper that so and so had called. Oh, let me see. I'll probably miss some of the things I wanted to tell you, but here's one on rationing. That made an interesting life because I mentioned before some of the things that were so scarce. And we had gas rationing, and you could only buy so many new tires in a year, depending on a car, or and maybe you have an implement that needs something like that. Tires. There were certain foods, sugar, coffee, tea, many more. But those are the first things I thought of that were rationed. I think that we even had trouble getting eggs, but lucky for us, we had most of our relatives on the farm, so we could get eggs, without too much trouble. Sometimes we had our own hens too. But anyway, so how does this rationing work? And I can't explain it to a detail, but we had books of stamps that would be used for certain things. And for some items like sugar, you would have so many stamps and even a period of time in which you could use it. And for tires and things of that kind, a man would have to explain that. I don't remember how that was, but that was all very, very closely regulated. And sometimes it got a little tough to go through something else. Quite a lot of people use sorghum in place of their sugar. Sorghum was more like a syrup. But it did something to the recipes that you were using if you were a cook. Because, as you might guess, granulated sugar sure works a lot better in some recipes than a cup of the syrup would. So it was an interesting time where everything had its problem. The churches, if I talk too long, somebody has to stop me. The churches even went through some change, and that started already in the First World War, where in our church, in the Reformed Church here in town, and we were called the German Church. We always had a German service, but usually the older the church got, we had English service and a German service. So it finally got to be during this early years of the World War II where German had to be dropped. And that was quite a change for us. Not for me, myself, but for the grandparents, the older people in the community. That was very disturbing. And that is one of the basic reasons that we have I still call it the Second Christian Reformed here in town, the English church, as they used to say. And it was that because they left our church because we still were maintaining the German language. So that was a very touchy time in our history. I still want to mention a little bit about funerals. We had so many funerals, as you might guess, for soldiers and anybody in the service. And sad, but I was a member of the girls group that would be asked to sing at a lot of those funerals, and it was very touching all the time to be with the family and know that person was coming back. So but it took us right into the heart of all the things that are going on in the world, you know. We just felt that it was some of our responsibility. What we do for entertainment, it sounds like we never had any fun. But I know my dad had started the International Harvester business, and International Harvester used to send out an entertainment group every year, I think. And we'd use the school's gymnasium and stage, and everybody from all around. It was just packed with people. Everybody came. It was just a fun evening, just a smattering of, you know, jokes and music and anything. They didn't sell a tractor on those times, but they sure did make good feeling with customers. And John Deere also did some things like that. I think Alice Chalmers did. We had 3 implement dealerships in Wellsburg at that time. Isn't that something? Hard to believe today, isn't it? Don't have one. Oh dear. We had I say for kids, but it was not for young kids and young people. We had movie night. I remember on Thursday night, and we'd go to the Legion Hall, you know, where the insurance building is now, and they'd have a projector set up, and we'd sit on benches and get to see Abbott and Costello and all kinds of funny. They weren't all humorous, but most of them were, you know, because they were kids in the audience. Poor Nickel. We paid a nickel and got to see that movie. That was pretty nice. Of course, my brothers and I were town kids. We got to do those things. Town kids got had a little edge on country kids at that time, but we took advantage of it, I guess. And of course, there was always the school sports that maintained us: spring, summer, fall, winter. In 1948, now I'm jumping. You know, all these things carried a span of over 10 years. We started in the early 40s, 1941, and the year I graduated from college at Iowa State, as we left campus, we passed the first bona fide building that was being put up. First one since the war. And so many of our classes were in Quonset huts and all temporary buildings all over. And that was the first building that was being built on the campus. That was in 1952, and war was declared in 1941. So you know how long it took for recovery. In Wellsburg here, homes, I lived on the west end of town, and all on that street had all been cornfields all up the street. And there were several new basements dug, and then they put a cover. It would be staying about this high above the soil level for a roof, and that's where the family, whoever wanted that a home built there, would live until the materials like wood and whatever you need for a home, they would be available. And sometimes they live in those basements for 2 to 3 years before there'd be materials for those homes. So when you ride out that way, and there are more of them everywhere, but you just have to think. Sometimes I do that. Of course, I'm in a little different vantage point than the rest of you. I can see in my mind's eye how Wellsburg was in those days, and see how different it is today. Where I live, by the golf course, that was all cornfield. For all the years I lived in my parents' home in the west end of town, it was all fields until they started putting those basements in the late 40s, early 50s. And John Lindeman was the farmer, and he'd often have a pair of mules in his barn, and I don't know what their real names were, because he'd always, if he'd see my Uncle George out working, doing something out by my dad's business, then then the mules would be called George and Francis. And James would be George and what. And he was so funny, but you know, those are treasures that I have, those memories. It was such a different time. It was such a sad time. And yet life went on and we had such a good time also growing up. We learned a lot of appreciation for the things that we were able to buy. And those nylon hose was one of the best things that were ever developed. Oh man, that was one of my graduation gifts, a pair of nylon hose. We've come a long way, haven't we? I probably missed a few things, but not too many. So do you have any questions? Did I leave something out that you might have liked to hear? Oh, I can think of one more thing. Since we had so many shortages of foods and so on, of course, my dad wouldn't always tell us, you know, why this happened or how this happened. But we also had a train going through town, you know, every night during the night and once during the day. And once in a while, there'd be something sitting on a bucket or a package on our back doorstep. And it might be a gallon of sorghum or something that had come through, and they would bring it over, either give it to Dad as part of the bill or, you know, somehow it was given to us. And that was called black market stuff. Sometimes you put in the buy, and it was all under the table. But somehow those things got through. That was an interesting side too, because we didn't want anybody to be caught. But of course we weren't involved in it. We were just on the receiving end in that case. But did I see a hand up or anything? Okay, I think it's time for me to stop. If there's something you think of after a while and that might be able to tell you a little bit about, catch me. I'll give it a try. Nice to meet you.
All right. There were a couple things I forgot to mention. One is that we do have lunch over here. We'll have tea, lemonade, cookies, and banana bread. I think Tammy was cooking. So, and we have a display here. We have Civil War, and then World War I, and then World War II. If you have questions about that, the diary that Tammy read from World War I, there's a display of that that man, and the flag that draped his coffin is over there too. So that's there. And then we have some items for sale if you care to purchase anything. There's postcards and the alumni book, and those are over there. And then of course there are displays upstairs if you care to go up there. If you've never been up, take a look. Okay, let's see. I'm trying to think. Am I forgetting anything? Next week, Ginny Groninger will be with us, and a couple of her cousins, I think, are coming too, to talk about the very first general store in Wellsburg that I think was at the Doyen Furniture. I know that. The Doyen Furniture store, that's all I can ever remember that was there. But before that, there was Wellsburg's first general store, which was founded by her, I would say, great-great-grandpa, probably. Joe Doyen Sr., I believe. But she'll be bringing some pictures of that building and of her family. So that's next week. So we hope you'll be back to join us for that. And in conclusion, I believe Burdette's going to play the Star Spangled Banner. So we have our flag. If you'd want to stand for that, stretch your legs while he plays that, and then that will be the conclusion of the program.
The senior rock recovery.
cookies, lemonade, or you service?
I'm gonna go.